And here they start their attack. March 16th, 1968, 7:15 in the morning. Out in the fields, a farmer frantically raised his hands by way of both greeting and to show he had no weapon. He was immediately felled by a burst from a machine gun. Along with the gunships, almost everyone in 1st and 2nd platoons was firing their weapons, and now 3rd platoon was joining in. The moment a Vietnamese was spotted, volleys of fire were loosed off, and the enemy fell, wounded or dying. It was apparent to Bernhardt, as it was to virtually everyone gathered there on the ground, that they were receiving no return fire at all. There was no incoming. Burkhold came across a hut which had been raked with bullets. Inside, Burkhold discovered 3 children, a woman with a flesh wound in her side, and an old man squatting down, hardly able to move. He had been seriously wounded in both legs. From 6 feet, Burkhold aimed his .45 caliber pistol and pulled the trigger, causing the top of the man's head to fly off. It was a sight that would forever be etched in Maple's memory. Burkhold claimed to have shot the old man as an act of mercy. Harry Stanley saw that the fleeing villagers were offering no resistance. His friend Alan Boyce, who lived in New Jersey, only a couple of miles from Maples, came up behind him with a Vietnamese farmer aged between 40 and 50 years in custody. He wore black pajamas and his shirt hung open so that Stanley could see his chest. Boyce pushed the man forward to where Stanley was standing beside the trail. Suddenly, and for no reason, Boyce stabbed the man with the bayonet attached to the end of his rifle. He fell to the ground, grasping for breath. Boyce killed him, and then grabbed another man being detained, shot him in the neck, and threw him into a well, lobbing an M26 grenade after him. "That's the way you gotta do it," he told Simpson. Robert Lee, the platoon medic, joined in the frenzy but confined his efforts to slaughtering animals. He killed a cow that had been injured. Lee was from a farming community and didn't want to see the beast suffer. Up front, he and the platoon sergeant, Isaiah Cowan, could see women and children being slain. They were stunned by what was happening all around them. The further they went into the village, the more bodies they found. To Conti, and he's another guy, Conti, the men appeared all psyched up when they landed. The shooting, once it began, created almost a chain reaction. He joined in without killing anyone. Inside the village, his comrades appeared out of control. Families huddled together for safety in houses, in yards, and in bunkers, only to be mown down with automatic weapon fire or blown apart by fragmentation grenades. Women and children were pushed into bunkers and grenades thrown after them. At one point, wandering off on his own, Conti found a woman aged about 20 with a 4-year-old child. He forced her to perform oral sex on him while he held a gun at the child's head, threatening to kill it. Half a dozen people from both platoons then witnessed a stocky, blonde-haired 2nd platoon soldier from Kansas City called Gary Roshevitz become hysterical when troops from 1st platoon were walking a small group of villagers back for screening. Roshevitz, aged 25, was older than most of the grunts in the company. Standing almost 6 feet tall and weighing close to 230 pounds, he made a surprise grab for Roy Wood's M16 and demanded the weapon as a trade for his M79, but Wood wasn't having any. "Don't turn them over to the company," Roshevitz appealed to those gathered there. "Kill them." Wood, who was physically by far the smaller of the two men, held tightly onto his rifle. Roshevitz then snatched a hold of Renato Simpson's M16, turned and shot a Vietnamese farmer in the head. Wood began feeling sick at the sight of the man's brain spilling on the ground as he turned away. Roshevitz shot 2 more peasants in the head before handing the gun back to Simpson. In the northern position of the village, 2nd platoon had also run berserk. Employing the routine combat assault technique used by Calley, Stephen Brooks' men also approached line abreast in 3 squads. Firing as they moved, they came to dwellings and yelled out "Lai Day" in Vietnamese for "come here." The villagers sheltering inside homemade shelters or bunkers. Fragmentation grenades were tossed inside. Homes were sprayed with automatic fire. Children aged 6 or 7 came toward them with their hands outstretched, saying "chop, chop." They asked for food and candy they had received from other American soldiers on the 2 previous visits to the village. The soldiers scythed them down. After one group of Vietnamese were killed in front of a hut, the first squad leader, Sergeant Kenneth Shield, began telling his men that he didn't like what they were doing, but that they had to obey orders. The villagers had huddled together for safety, but the Americans poured fire into them, tearing their bodies apart, one man firing a machine gun at random, other using M16s on automatic. Brooks radio operator Dean Fields witnessed Renato Simpson shoot a woman with a baby from a distance of about 25 meters. Her arm was shot almost completely off at the wrist. All that held it on was a fragile piece of flesh. She ran into a hooch and someone yelled an order for her and the baby to be killed. Max Hudson, the weapons squad leader, formed a machine gun team with Floyd Wright. As soon as they passed the tree line, they were confronted less than 30 feet away by a middle-aged woman climbing out of a tunnel using both hands. She was unarmed, but they opened fire and she fell back into the tunnel. Hudson and Wright took turns on the machine gun. Whenever they came across any Vietnamese, they opened fire, killing them. Hudson could see people firing all around him. The whole scene was one of chaos and confusion, with people moving, yelling, and shouting. Some of the troops were afraid they would be shot by their own men. In a clearing near a small hooch, a group of 15 Vietnamese had been gathered. 4 women in their 30s, 3 in their 50s, 3 girls in their late teens, and 5 children ages between 3 and 14. Standing around were 7 or 8 soldiers from different squads, including Hutto, Torres, and Roshevitz. Gonzalez heard someone yell that if anyone was behind the Vietnamese to take cover because they were going to open fire. A shot rang out and a bullet penetrated the head of a young child being carried by its mother, blowing out the back of its skull. Others began firing until the entire group was dead. Gonzalez could stand no more. He turned away and vomited. Few words were spoken until someone said, "Let's move out." A soldier stooping over a tunnel yelled for the occupants to come out. Gonzalez moved closer and could hear people responding as if they were about to comply, whereupon the soldier threw in a grenade and yelled "fire in the hole," telling everyone to stand clear. Cali had been called twice that morning on the radio by an anxious Medina. "What is happening over there?" Medina demanded to know, challenging the slow progress of the 1st Platoon. He wanted Cali to get his men back online and keep moving. This made the young platoon commander nervous. Throughout his time with the company, he had frequently been made the butt of Medina's jokes. Medina knew Cali couldn't command the respect of his men. Now, under pressure, Cali replied that large groups of civilians had gathered and were slowing the platoon down. Never one to accept excuses, Medina told Cali simply to get rid of them. So when Cali came across Meadlow and Conti in the clearing and said, "Take care of them," his intention was clear. It was his way of getting Medina off his back. Conti thought nothing of the implications of Cali's request when he simply replied, "Okay." Like many in the company, he regarded the man as a joke and resented the way Cali tried to suck up to the men one minute by calling them by their first names and then shouted and bawled at them the next. Conti felt his platoon commander had absolutely no leadership ability. Among the squatting Vietnamese were 10 to 15 men with beards and 10 women, as well as a handful of very elderly gray-haired women who could hardly walk. The rest were children of all ages, from babies up to early teens. Cali, who was carrying a bandolier of ammunition on one shoulder, said, "I thought I told you to take care of them." Meadlow responded somewhat naively, We're watching over them." No, reposted Callie. I want them killed. He moved over to where Conti was standing beside Meadlow. We'll get online and fire into them. Conti and Meadlow looked at each other and backed off, neither of them wanting a part in what was about to happen. Callie, losing his temper, beckoned them toward him. Come here, come here. Come on, we'll line them up, we'll kill them. Conti, searching for an excuse, pointed out that he was carrying a grenade launcher and he didn't want to waste ammunition. Perhaps he could keep guard over by the tree line in case anyone tried to get away, he suggested. Callie turned to Meadlow. Fire when I say fire. Conti stood behind them as Callie and Meadlow, standing side by side, blazed away. They stood only 10 feet from their hapless victims, changing magazines from time to time. The Vietnamese screamed, yelled, and tried to get up. It was pure carnage as heads were shot off along with limbs. The fleshier body parts were ripped to shreds. Meadlow had taken 23 fully loaded magazines for his M16 in his pack when they had left Dottie. He fired in a spraying motion. He noticed one man dressed in red fall dead as he fired the rifle on automatic until the magazine was exhausted. Then he reloaded. He switched to semi-automatic fire and loaded the third magazine. After a minute or so, Meadlow couldn't continue. Tears flooded down his cheeks. He turned, stuck his rifle in Conti's hand, and said, "You shoot them." Conti pushed the weapon back. "If they are going to be killed, I'm not going to do it. Let him do it," he said, pointing at Callie. By this time, Conti could see only a few children were left standing. Mothers had thrown themselves on top of the young ones in the last desperate bid to protect them from bullets raining down on them. The children were trying to stand up. Callie opened fire again, killing them one by one. Conti swore at him. Finally, when it appeared to be all over, Callie calmly turned and said, "Okay, let's go." Suddenly, someone yelled out that more Vietnamese, 5 women and 6 children, some distance away, were making a break for the tree line. Callie burst out, get them, kill them." Meadlow's face was flushed. His eyes were still full of tears when he arrived with Grizik at the ditch site and found Callie sitting down. "We've got another job to do," he said, looking up at them. About 10 members of the platoon were guarding 40 to 50 Vietnamese. Babies were crying and crawling around. James Dursey, a heavy-set Irish-Italian from Brooklyn, was looking at a man in white robes with a goatee beard whom he took to be a Buddhist monk praying over an elderly woman. She was seriously ill and had been carried through the village on a narrow wooden platform which the Vietnamese used as a bed. Callie was now on his feet. Harry Stanley appeared on the scene and tried to question the monk, who was crying and bowing as he tried to make himself understood. Callie couldn't understand him. Grizik, who had attended Vietnamese language classes in Hawaii, tried more questions and got nowhere. Callie was getting more and more impatient. Where had the Viet Cong gone? Where were the weapons? Where were the NVA? When the man shook his head, Callie struck him in the mouth with his rifle butt. Just then, a child, aged about 2 years and parted from its mother, managed to crawl up to the top of the ditch. Dursey watched horrified as Callie picked up the child, shoved it back down the slope, and shot it before returning to question the monk. The villagers pleaded for the holy man's life. Stanley asked the bearded man the same questions in Vietnamese that Callie was asking in English in an effort to defuse the situation, but the monk vainly replied that there were no North Vietnamese soldiers in the village. There were no weapons. Stanley translated these replies. Immediately, Callie grabbed the monk, pulled him round, hurled him into the paddy, and opened fire with Meadlow's M16. As the elderly Mama-san, lying prostrate, tried to get up, she too was killed. More Vietnamese, shepherded by soldiers, were arriving on the scene, and Callie indicated to Meadlow and Boyce he wanted everyone killed. He began pushing peasants into the irrigation channel. Others joined in, using their rifle butts to shove wailing Vietnamese down the steep slope. Some jumped in by themselves. Others sat down on the edge, moaning and crying, clearly aware that disaster was imminent. It was a pitiful sight. Until the time all the firing started, Herbert Carter had been kneeling beside Dursey, quietly playing with a couple of children. Dursey said incredulously, "I think Callie wants them all killed." Carter said, "Oh no. He can send me to jail, but I'm not going to kill anybody," said Dursey, beginning to move away and wondering what would happen to him for refusing to fire. Dursey was another one who liked to play with the children. Earlier in the day, he'd been devastated after he opened fire and killed someone running from the village. It turned out to be a woman carrying a baby, and Dursey was horrified and ashamed by what he had done. Olson had seen he was really cut up about it. A woman standing next to Robert Maples showed him a bullet wound in her left arm. He felt helpless. There was nothing he could do for her. Callie shoved her in the ditch and told Maples, "Load your machine gun and shoot these people." Maples shook his head and replied, "I'm not going to do that." Callie turned his M16 on Maples as if to shoot him then and there. Maples was surprised and relieved when some of the other soldiers interposed to protect him. Callie backed off. Seconds later, he and Meadlow began firing. A machine gun opened up, and one of the squad leaders tried to usher the men into line so they could all fire simultaneously. Dursey stood completely frozen, watching disbelievingly as the Vietnamese tried frantically to hide under one another, mothers protecting babies. Screaming at Dursey above the sounds of the M16 on full automatic, Meadlow continued pouring shells into the ditch. Crying hysterically once more, he stopped for a second. "Why aren't you firing?" he pleaded with Dursey. "Fire, why don't you fire?" The onlookers saw remnants of shredded human beings, hundreds of pieces of flesh and bone flying up in the air as the shallow ravine was repeatedly sprayed with bullets. Magazine after magazine was reloaded during the mass execution.